Hope you're all doing well today. My name's Houston. I'm one of the ministers on staff here, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning. I'm thrilled because we are starting a brand new 4-part message series, and I say we because Paul and I are actually going to be alternating this month. So I'll be on this week, he'll be on the next week, I'll be on the following week, Lord willing, and we'll finish out this month. And we're starting a new series today called Rivers and Walls and Battles. And we're picking up in the story of God's people as they are on one side of the Jordan River and they're about to cross over into the land of Canaan, and we're exploring this cyclical nature of God's people. And really the subtitle says it all, which is, it is a journey of freedom, failure, and faithfulness. And I'm excited to get going this morning because this is such a big moment in Israel's history. You know, they have waited for 500 years for this promise that their ancestor Abraham had been received, this promise that I'm going to prepare this place for you. There's going to be a land for you. It's going to be a land for your children. They've been in slavery. They've been in the wilderness, and now they're about to cross over. And the book of Joshua is where we pick up, and I'm excited about this because the book of Joshua contains a lot of really good lessons for us. There's a lot of values in it, a lot of principles, a lot of metaphors that we can take and apply to our lives today. But I love the way that the book opens up. And it opens up after God has led Moses away, and he's actually buried him. No one ever knew where Moses was buried. He had been one of his first big leaders, and God didn't want him to have a similar comparison to the pyramids of Egypt, you know, and so God actually took him away. And he comes, and he has a conversation with Joshua. And this is what he says. Moses, my servant is dead. Now then. Which to me is just kind of a funny way to start, isn't it? Hey, Josh, Moses is dead. Now then. And here, right here in this first line, this second verse of the book, is a lesson for current leaders and next generation leaders. Because the mission does not end with the leader. It keeps going on after that. And so if you're the current leader, this is pretty sobering. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then. Okay, we're not going to take a lot of time. You know, God honors people in different ways. We're not going to take a whole lot of time. Moses is dead. Now then. Joshua, you need to be ready. And then he goes on, and he says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them. And here is, I think he's drawing this out a little bit because it's not just a physical crossing. This is very emotional for the people. Most of these people he's actually speaking about, they were born in the wilderness. They had only heard the stories of what Egypt was like. They had only heard the stories of what the land was going to be like. So this was a very emotional experience for them. But then God goes on, he goes a little bit further with this, and it almost seems redundant. It's kind of confusing. He says, get ready to cross the Jordan into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. And you're like, God, what? Into the land you're about to give to them, the Israelites. Isn't that a little bit redundant? I mean, God, who else are you talking about? Who else have you been leading for this last 40 years? Who else have you made this promise to? Who else has been, in slavery? Who else has been in the wilderness with you? You've been giving manna to every day. And who else have you been talking to? To the Israelites. And it seems redundant, but really God is sending a message here because this is actually one of just the first times that God has addressed them as Israelites. All before and all in the wilderness, it was the children of Israel. And here, he's calling to them and saying, you are grown up. And now you have grown-up responsibilities. You're an adult. So for the first time, Israel, when you cross over, I'm going to treat you like adults. I love the book of Joshua, but there's a problem, or at least a perceived problem, that often emerges when we read the book of Joshua. Maybe you grew up reading the Bible, and so you've read through it before, and maybe you've kind of felt this tension, but not really known how to articulate it. Or maybe you've articulated it, and you're not really sure how to respond to it. Or maybe you didn't grow up reading the Bible, and this is one of your first times, and you're open to Joshua, and you're reading through it, and how is this possible? Because the tension that often happens internally, and sometimes it's very critical from the outside, is this question of how can an all-loving God direct his people to destroy the lives of other people. I mean, here we have God's people he's sending into this land to drive out the current residents of the land. How? You say your God is all-loving. How can an all-loving God direct his people to destroy the lives of other people? And some have actually taken this to a whole nother level. I read a book a couple years ago called The God Delusion. It's written by Richard Dawkins. You may be familiar with him. He's an evolutionary biologist, prominent atheist, very outspoken against Judeo-Christian religion, really just religion in general, but he seems to have something like real specific for Christians, and it seems to be out to get them. And here's what he says in The God Delusion. It's chapter 2. He says this: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. And he goes on. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. And yes, I had to practice saying that. Had to look up a couple of those words too. He's very brilliant. He's a very smart person. And yet, I get a little bit frustrated with a statement like this because I have a personal relationship with God. And maybe you do too, and maybe you take a little bit of offense. How could you say that? You don't even know God. He's my friend. He's my father. How could you talk about my father that way? But the reality is, and this is so important because this is becoming increasingly more popular to do, is to challenge this God of the Old Testament as just being this vindictive, bloodthirsty being. But the reality is that this is criticism without context, right? I mean, if you know the God of the Old Testament, and you really know the God of the New Testament because you know his son, who's the exact imprint of his nature, you know this is criticism without context. And it can be so easy to get offended by something like this. What I would encourage you to do is just take a deep breath and understand that criticism without context, or someone who's making criticism and they don't really understand the whole part of the story, you can just say, well, you just don't get it. Or you can respond with patience and clarity, and trust me, this is how Jesus would respond. In patience and clarity. Particularly to Mr. Dawkins, his argument against God, our friend and our Father. What he's trying to do so often, what so many other people try to do, is they wrongly assume that our faith is built on this house of cards, right? And that if I can just pull out one of these cards, if I can just pull out and show you how that miracle of the Old Testament, there's no way it happened, then somehow this house of cards falls down. Or if I can show you how maybe God's just not as just as you think, then maybe that whole house of cards falls down. But for Christians, right? Christians, we know that it's very different than that. Our faith is not built on a house of cards. In fact, the stories of the Old Testament, they're not the foundation of our faith. But rather, our faith is built on the undeniable evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Right? So pay attention. This is so important. The foundation of our faith does not rest on the stories of the Old Testament, but rather on the undeniable evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus, you may have heard me say this before, but he predicted his own death and resurrection and pulled it off. And I just think anyone that can predict their own resurrection and pull it off, we should just listen to whatever they say, right? We should listen to whatever they say about these criticisms, about the God of the Old Testament. Jesus, what did you think about that? Jesus, how do you handle some of the tension? How do you answer some of the questions that are coming from the outside, some of the criticism? And we should listen to what Jesus has to say, particularly in this series as it relates to Joshua. I want to also respond to this criticism in two other ways. The first is that we often assume, or many often assume when you're reading this, is that this is a story of good people versus bad people. You know, we have God's people on one side and we have not God's people on the other side. And so we have the good guys and we have the bad guys. But God actually responds to that very, very differently. He actually says this is not a story of good people versus bad people. And he addresses this long before the Israelites were about to cross over into the Jordan River. He says, hey, Israel, you're going to go in and you're going to drive out these people. And I want you to know, it's not because of your righteousness. It's because of their wickedness. It's not because of your righteousness that I'm about to put you in a land that is kind of the mecca, the center of all civilization at this point, and that you're going to influence all other nations. It's because the people who are there are wicked, and they have become like a cancer spreading throughout my world. And it's necessary for us to have some perspective here, because the residents of the land were worshipers of many gods, one of whom was the god Molech. And they believed that Molech required them to sacrifice their own children just to keep him happy, just to have a good harvest. And let me ask you this. If they were willing to sacrifice their babies by fire and by water, how much more then do you think they treated each other with wickedness and evil? How much more then do you think they treated those who came into their land with wickedness and with evil if they were willing to sacrifice their own babies by fire and by water just to have a good harvest? Also, the residents of the land, there were some giants in the land. And these weren't just tall people. Right? These were the descendants of fallen angels, the intermarrying of fallen angels with the daughters of men. And so here we have not a fight between good people and bad people, but so much more. The third response that I would say to this criticism is actually found within the text itself, and it's actually with an encounter with Joshua. And Joshua and the people that crossed over the Jordan, God had stopped the waters to allow them to cross. It was a wonderful miracle, and Jesus seemed to believe it happened. And they crossed over, and they were met by these walls of Jericho. You remember this? You probably learned this if you grew up in church, you know. And they walked around the walls multiple times. The walls came crumbling down. And they continued on in some of these battles. But before they got to the battles, Joshua is standing outside these walls of Jericho, and he meets someone. Let me just read it for you. This is Joshua chapter 5. It says, "Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand." And Joshua is much more strong and courageous than I. Joshua actually goes up to him, and he asks, "Are you for us? Are you for our enemies?" Meaning, are you one of the good guys? Are you one of the bad guys? And the response of the man is so telling, and it puts us into so much good perspective. It helps us understand that there's not a fight between good people and bad people. And this is how he responds. He says, "Are you one of the good guys or are you one of the bad guys?" Neither. "Joshua, I don't know who you think the good guys are and who you think the bad guys are. I'm neither of them. But as commander of the army of the Lord," that's whose side I am on. "As commander of the army of the Lord, I'm on the Lord's side. And because I'm on the Lord's side, and because this is his fight, I have come." And here we have these Israelites, and we have Joshua understanding their role in the story, to be partners spreading goodness throughout the world. Understanding that those in the land, their desire for evil has grown so much that they're now a stage 4 cancer, destroying themselves from within and spreading that all throughout the world because of their geographic position in civilization at this point. But on the other side of the rivers, on the other side of the walls, on the other side of the battles, is freedom. Yes, they have been set free from Egypt, but they've been wandering for 40 years in the wilderness and have not yet begun to enjoy it. And here's a lesson for us right up front, is that enjoying freedom requires embracing discipline. Because Joshua, because Israel, because people, when you get over into that other side and you're living in this land, you're not only called to be different, you're not only called to be set apart, you're not only called to be holy, you're not only called to be my priest, you are called to challenge the culture in which you live. And it requires an enormous amount of discipline to be able to be different when everyone else is the same. And it requires an enormous amount of discipline to be able to challenge the culture in which you live. Because it's so easy to just snuggle up against that line right there and just say, yeah, I'm different, but I'm kind of like you, when God calls us to so much more? Does he not? Does God not call us to so much more? This message today is not really about facing physical giants, obviously. The Apostle Paul says, our fight's not against flesh and blood. It's not really, this message today, it's not really about facing our metaphorical giants, though that's certainly included in that. Today's message is about living in a land, living in a culture that you're required to be different, you're expected to be different, your partnership, your acceptance, especially if you've been baptized into Jesus, you are called to be different and to challenge the culture in which you live. That is a daunting task. And so the question that I want to ask as we transition in this morning is, what keeps us going when being faithful gets hard? What keeps us going? What's the driving motivator? What is underneath us that helps us to keep going? Obviously, the Spirit's with us, but what is it that we are going after? What's the driving? When being faithful, when choosing to be different and choosing to confront and to challenge the world that we live in, what keeps us going when being faithful gets hard? And so I actually want to give you basically the main point of this message right up front in case you need to leave early or I lose you anywhere along the way. And so here is the point. A reward is waiting for you. And in this message today, we're going to look at a story. This is after the river, and this is after the walls, and this is after some of the battles. And this is when some of the people, they're actually coming. Now they have a home base in the land that will one day be called the land of Israel. And they're starting to divide up where they're going to live. And Caleb, you remember Caleb, Joshua's old buddy? You remember 45 years earlier when Moses had sent out 12 spies, and they all came back, and only 2 of them had been faithful? Well, Caleb was one of them. Joshua was the other. And so here is a story that I want to draw this truth from, about Caleb approaching Joshua and having a conversation with him. It's pretty fascinating. Let's see it. Caleb says to Joshua, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me." Josh, you remember this, right? You know what he said. He says, "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought back a report according to my convictions. I knew we could take them. I knew we didn't have enough people, but I knew we could take them because the Lord was on our side. I knew there were giants in the land, but I brought back a report according to my convictions. But my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear." And what he says next is so central to understanding our main point today. This is what he says. "I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. I, however, when all my friends and all the other people that were in our little group, except for you, Josh, we're turning away and we're turning the people's heart. I, however, followed wholeheartedly." Caleb goes on. He says, "So on that day, Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever. You're going to have a reward in the land while all the other people are going to die in the wilderness, and a new generation is going to be born and rise up, and they will actually be the ones to cross over and receive the reward that has been so long promised. When their parents had the opportunity to cross over, no, they will die in the wilderness. Caleb, you'll be one of the few that lives to see the day when that land is yours. Why?" Moses says, "Because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly." Caleb continues the story. This is what he says. "Now then, Josh, just as the Lord promised, He has kept me alive for 45 years, since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel was moving about in the wilderness. I've waited a long time for this. So here I am today, 85 years old. And I would love to be able to say what Caleb says when I'm 85 years old. That's what he says. He says, and I'm still as strong today as the day when Moses sent me out. And I'm just as vigorous to go out into battle now as I was then. Now, give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. And the story kind of concludes by saying this. So Hebron, this land that was later renamed Hebron, has belonged to Caleb ever since. Why? Because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. Now, this is one of many stories in Scripture where this point is illustrated. That wholehearted service to the Lord, wholehearted service, deserves a reward. And so when you pour yourself out and when you're all in, a reward is waiting for you. And you may be sitting there this morning and asking the question, well, what's the reward? Well, what I learned, I have little children. When they were even littler, they would ask this question whenever I say, hey guys, hey, help me out. We're all going to help together on this, and when we're done, you'll get a treat. And they want to say, what's the treat? What are they really asking? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? And you may be sitting there and you say, I know what the reward is. Streets of gold, a mansion, a robe, and a crown. I already know all that. You know, I'm making a list of all the things that I'm going to get when I get there. I've checked it twice. But the reward is so much better than streets of gold. It's so much better than a mansion, a robe, and a crown. The reward is actually peace. You know what peace is? Peace is all that stress that you've got at work and all that stress of all those relationships that you've got that are just not going the way you really want them to go. Peace is being able to know, God, this is in your hands. I trust you with it. And all that anxiety and all that stress, it just washes away. And the reward is also joy. Joy coming from the work itself. The work of bringing heaven to earth. And you find yourself with this joy that you're like, how do I have this joy? I used to hate service, and now I find myself drawn to it. I find myself energized by the work. I find so much joy in the work of spreading God's goodness throughout the world. You know what else is part of the reward? Contentment. You know what contentment is? It's when you spend some time with someone else who's got a lot more stuff than you do. They got a lot more things than you do. They got a lot of more things and more stuff and more. And you come home, you just sigh because you're grateful for what you have. You're no longer distracted by all those other things. In fact, you start looking around and you're saying, I've got too much stuff. And I've got too much money. I need to find someone else who doesn't have as much. And you find yourself giving it away, even though what you have is less than what you used to think you should have. Contentment is the reward of wholehearted service to the Lord. You know what else is part of the reward? Godliness. Godliness is when, through the wholehearted service to the Lord, you find yourself looking more and more like God every day. And those things that used to hold you back, and that sin that just nagged you, and it just wouldn't seem to let you go. And you find yourself attracted to it. You're no longer attracted to it. You have new desires. The reward is that God gives you a new desire. And you find yourself in the work becoming more and more like Him. You know what else is part of the reward? It's rest. Rest is when you keep pouring your cup out to fill someone else. And again, you pour your cup out, and again, it's refilled. And again, you find yourself just as strong now as you were then. And again, you find yourself just as vigorous to go out and to do the work now as you were then. And this list of this reward, this peace and this joy and this contentment, this godliness, this rest, this reward, which we don't have to wait for. We actually get to begin experiencing it now. It's because of this reward that the Apostle Paul, when he addresses different groups in Ephesians, and he's addressing fathers, and he's addressing parents, he's addressing children, he comes to slaves. And you think he would say, now slaves, run away, slip away in the night, take off when no one's looking. You would think that's what he says, but he says something completely different because of this reward. And this is what he says, and this is in Ephesians chapter 6. He says, slaves, serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people. Why? Because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you. Serve wholeheartedly. Now listen. If the Apostle Paul, because of this reward, can say something like, serve wholeheartedly to slaves of their masters, then how much more then does he say serve wholeheartedly to us today in all of our other areas of responsibility? Men, serve your wives wholeheartedly. Parents, serve your children wholeheartedly. Students, middle school, high school, college, serve your teachers, serve your classmates, serve your administration wholeheartedly. I don't agree with what they said. No. Serve wholeheartedly. But I don't think that they're, no. Serve wholeheartedly. Elders, shepherds, small group leaders, serve your little flocks wholeheartedly. Church, serve your community wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you. But when it comes to service, there's a catch. And here's the catch. Paul goes on. He says, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good you do, whether you're slave or free. You're going to be rewarded, Paul says, for whatever good you do. Here's the catch. What you reserve from the Lord limits your reward, because you will be rewarded on the good that you do, not just, your desire to do good, not just your intentions. I have really good intentions to do good. I really am a good person. No. You're going to be rewarded based on the good that you do. So whatever you reserve from the Lord, whatever you hold back from the Lord, you will not be rewarded on those things. Whatever you limit, whatever you reserve from the Lord, limits your reward. So my question for you today, what part of my heart have I reserved for myself? And I want you to ask that question of yourselves. What part of my heart have I reserved from myself? What part of my service to my wife have I reserved for myself? What part of my service to my community have I reserved for myself? What part of my giving and my finances have I reserved for myself? And then I want you to ask the question, is it worth it? Is it worth it? The end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Joshua and the end of Joshua all end basically the same. After the rivers, after the walls, after the battles, there's a choice. And it's a choice to do good. It's a choice for blessing. And it's a choice to not do good, to receive curses. And in this choice, you have to be able to evaluate the reward that comes from that. You have a reward that you can begin receiving in this life from the Lord. peace and joy, contentment, godliness, and rest? Or all that other stuff, all those other things? Is it worth it? Is it really worth it? I mean, when you pause and you ask yourself, all of that stuff that I've been going after and all the work that I've been doing, is it really worth it? All that stuff that I've been holding, is it really worth it? When you have the opportunity to experience peace, when you have the opportunity to experience rest, what you reserve from the Lord limits your reward. And I hope that you'll take a moment to ask yourself, all that other stuff I've been holding back, is it really worth it? Let's pray. Father, I thank you. I thank you for such a simple message, because you've actually laid it out for us so simply. You've called us to be different, and you've called us to challenge the world. And in so doing, you've given us a reward, or at least the option for a reward. And I know the people in this room, and I know the people who are listening to this message, who have experienced the reward that you give of peace and joy and contentment, godliness and rest. I pray that you will inspire them and that you will invigorate them, that you will fill them up to go back out and to be able to share that message of the reward of the Lord is so much better. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for his resurrection that lives within us. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.